Hello, everyone. It is my pleasure and my absolute delight to introduce our speaker today. Jennifer Mara DeSilva is an associate professor teaching stream here at the University of Toronto. She's the vice principal of Woodsworth College, but she teaches at Victoria College, also in the Vic One program. At Woodsworth College, besides her administrative job, she also teaches digital humanities, and she'll probably talk to you about that as well. Um, she does have a formal biography, which you've probably read, and that will tell you that she has published on the College of Cardinals, papal commemorations, nepotism, sex workers, and history on film. And she's the author of the Office of Ceremonies and Advancement in Curial Rome. So you might want to ask her where the mistakes in conclave were, and get her talking about that if there are any mistakes. And I asked her, how is it that she came as a trained historian to be talking about women's labor in Renaissance Florence, and especially the labor of sex workers? And being a very practical person, she gave me a very practical answer. And that is that at one point she had been asked to teach a course that would be a comparative course, but the topic had to be discussed about two different historical periods, and it had to have a lot of scholarship and data that students could work with. And also, it had to take place in two different places. So it was really comparative and interdisciplinary. And she, to her surprise, found that sex work was one topic that was absolutely fitting for this. So, lots of extant records and attracts a lot of interest, and I'm sure our interest as well. And that semester, that of that very practical approach to a new course led her to develop an expertise in the history of sex work in early modern Florence and in the progressive era of the Midwest. And she worked with a bunch of graduate students and actually published on this topic. And then she has one more item that she'd like to share with you. She comes to us not only as a professor, but as a professor who is very influential, including discovering that her own son, who is in first year here at the University of Toronto, wants to follow in her footsteps and become a historian. So I think that's a really nice legacy to leave. Jennifer.
Thank you so much, Anne. That's very kind. Although I'm certain my son Jonathan would say yes, but not like you, Mom. He's very good at caveats like that. Hello, everyone. I'm Jennifer Mara DeSilva. It's lovely to be here. Thank you for inviting me. I've had a wonderful time so far. I'm really grateful for the invitation to speak with you, and I've been told to brace myself because the question period is intense. So I am ready. Now, today, instead of a traditional research presentation, I'm going to give you a two-sided discussion, really, that reflects my role at Woodsworth College as a teacher scholar. And in addition to being, as Anne said, Woodsworth VP, I also teach in the digital humanities program there and the Renaissance Studies program at Victoria College. So today I'm going to bring those two programs together in a wonderful sort of melange, and we'll see how that goes. Now, specifically, I want to show you one aspect of my research that uses digital humanities to teach analytical skills and knowledge of early modern Florence. Now, I have spaced throughout my talk some audience participation moments, and of course, this is one. So, can anyone tell me or perhaps guess what is the digital humanities? Anyone? So maybe having to do with fingers. We actually have a course this semester, which is all about tactile digital humanities. It's about touch and haptics. But in this case, there's some touch, but not quite like that. But can I have some other suggestions? Michael is, but yes, there is definitely. Certainly. So what is the digital humanities? Do we have some guesses? Oh, repeat the guesses. So does it have to do with libraries to some degree? Is it about tactileness, about touch, perhaps, as in digits? Um, some of that, certainly. So it's a field that is quite broad. It generally is thought of in two parts. So it applies digital methods, computing, or uses applications to answer humanistic questions and pursue traditional humanities research. But it can also go in the other direction. So it can include mapping, often with geographic information systems data, web-based reading analysis, networking, or other visualization tools that bring libraries closer to the researcher. It helps us see more in our traditional sources, really. And it can also help bring humanist visions of the world to bear on or applied to the digital age. So we see a whole bunch of different conversations and practices that are overlapping. Now, these methods are particularly useful, as you'll see today, um, helping us see the structures of social geography. So, can you tell me what is social geography? I'm trying to make this as much like a first year class as I possibly can. Any suggestions? It helps me sort of get going, right? Oh no, you're on your own here, Dr. DeSilva. This is all for you. Um, so how humans inhabit space and how social factors influence their presence. So presence, distribution, and activities over a physical area. So what I'm going to talk about today is part thinking about groups of people, thinking about the placement of different types of sites. We're going to talk a lot about taverns. And how they all kind of live together in one historical period and one place, the city of Florence. Okay, so all right. Now, just before we get into the weeds of my research, I want to talk a little bit about sources. And hopefully, this will help you understand how we did the research that I'm going to present. And I'm going to talk about research that I have done, but also research that incorporates graduate students and undergraduates from my classes. So many of you might remember from history class that if you want to understand the past, you need to get as close as possible to it. And particularly, you need primary sources. So things that were created in the time, place, or by the people that you're investigating. This could be images, documents, objects, audio and film footage, anything from the period under investigation or created by the person or the idea that you are interested in. So the engraving that you see on the screen right now is a great introductory primary source for thinking about women and taverns. It was made by Bartolomeo Grassi in 1580 as part of his catalog entitled Of the True Portraits of Dress of All Parts of the World. And this catalog intends to shape our perception of different types of people, and of course, the places that we see these people in. So there are strong messages sent by Bartolomeo Grassi. And the image that you see shows us three women. The first one on your left, is the Putana Plebea. So she is, forgive my language, the common whore. In the middle, we have the Nobile Putana Veneziana, the noble Venetian whore, so one step up the ladder, and the Ruffiana Veneziana. This is the Venetian procuress. So to understand this image, you need to know that in the 14, 15, and 1600s, sex work was legal and regulated in many Italian cities. Venice was particularly known as a city for sex tourism. And so therefore, on the screen, you see three working women. Okay. Now, another question for the audience. What strikes you about these three figures? If you were going to describe them, what adjectives would you give me? And perhaps, how do you see that they are similar? How do you see that they are different? So, posture and how they carry themselves, would you say some are straight up and down, some are bent over? Certainly, yes. Ah, the procuress is quite different. Yes, poor dress. Now, what about the other two figures that you see? The putane. Um, are there? She is outrageously showing her leg. And the fact that she is the plebeian might tell you that modesty costs money, right? We have certain standards and they can be expensive. Um, and other thoughts, other observations. Eyes are blacked out, yes. The noble whore almost has a halo wing. Yes, so she has a veil that she is pulling back. And again, part of that revealing and concealing modesty that money can bring. Anything else? Yes, please. Yes. Her business where the common whore has to get out there and hustle. Yes, so our common whore we can think of as a streetwalker or perhaps someone who has less space, has to be more public. But the fact that the Rufiana, the procuress, is handing a note to our noble whore tells us that perhaps the noble whore has money for staff, that she has someone to perhaps screen her potential clients, and that there is a distance between her and potential firm friends is the phrase that is often used at that social level. Um, Now, can we talk? Oh, there's more. Yes, please, Linda. She does. Yes. So the life cycle in this profession is really interesting, and there hasn't quite been enough research. I hope that that will be something that I do in the next project. But the way each of these women are portrayed, including what they are wearing and their posture, is extremely important for understanding them. So, as the audience said, the common whore is lifting her skirt immodestly, but she is wearing quite a fancy dress. She is trying to reach above her station. The noble whore in the center wears slightly more jewelry, reveals her face from under a veil for us potential customers. Money does buy a bit more modesty. But the procuress is older. She's wrinkled. She has a bent back. We don't know how old she is, though, but she is projected to be substantially older than the other two women. And she hands a paper to the noble whore. As I said, perhaps a note from a client. Now, in the early modern imagination, this image was intended to show several things. First, the career paths for poor women who had no other skills or no other choice than to sell access to their bodies. Second, the life cycle of the sex worker that I mentioned, the young woman with good posture and flawless skin becomes old, perhaps very quickly, and moves from selling access to her own body to access to another woman's body. And third, a moral judgment. This is undoubted in the engraving. Sex work might have been legal and regulated in Italian cities like Venice, Rome, Florence, but it was still quite shameful. And the procuress's external decay, at least that's the way that contemporary viewers would have thought about this, reflects her internal moral corruption. Her profession takes a toll on her exterior as well as her interior. So, my research on early modern Italian sex workers began with teaching social history. I wanted to find a way for students to get close to regular people in the past, not kings and queens, but regular people who didn't leave nearly as many documents or written accounts of their lives, as many sources um, as wealthier people, people who were more literate, did. And so the trick I've found for finding sources is to think about people in groups, by professions, in terms of families, or areas within a community. So, this search for primary sources led me to the DeSilva project. And this is a digital humanities project. It's online, it's open access. If you were to do a Google search for it, you would find it and you could wander around. The DeSilva project maps census data to position households and businesses as they were in the past so that we can think about contemporary relationships and experiences. Now, this really is social geography. So, this project was created by Professors Nicholas Terpstra and Colin Rose, now at U of T and Brock University. So, it's homemade. And it has grown to be a leader in its field. The DeSilva project offered a crucial set of primary sources for thinking about regular people in Florence at particular moments in time. So the project provides tax census data for all the city's households in 1551, 1561, and 1632, right after a particularly severe plague. In this project, you can walk down the street and click on buildings to see who lived there, and compare their rent or property values, determine whether they were led by a female or a male household head, and think about the size of their household. And if one household occupied the entire building or it was broken up into apartments. And the examples that I use today I will show you alongside screenshots from the project, but you're welcome to visit the project's website and explore. So if you don't want to search the map yourself, the project gallery has some really interesting work that you can explore. Beautifully presented projects, all online. Investigating Florentine art, noise control, the plague, and the Jewish ghetto. So this is digital humanities at its finest. It's a terrific source for students, researchers, and the general public to ask and answer questions about the past. It has become the basis for many of my collaborations with students. And now I'm going to show you a couple of those that draw on the 1561 Florentine census data alongside other sources. All right, so I have been very cheeky and I've asked 4 people in the audience to help me out. Could I ask volunteer number 1, please, to read the text that they were given? And it is Pat, so she is receiving a microphone.
Okay, and this after I will tell you at lunch, I confessed I do not have an ear for languages. So please forgive me. In 1561, Lorsanina Bolognese was a registered sex worker called a meretrice or meretrice, originally from the University City of Bologna, north of Florence. She paid 13.5 scudi in annual rent for her home at the corner of Via Polizzuolo and Via de Canacci in the Florentine quarter of Santa Maria Novella. She rented the home that she shared with another woman from Camilla Pistolese, the wife of Stefano Genovese, who had retired to the Sant Elisabetta del Convertita, the convent for retired sex workers.
Fantastic. Thank you, Pat. It's really helpful. Now I'm starting with L'Orsolina, which means the little she-bear, because 1, it's evocative, and 2, she offers everything that we need to get hooked on working with census data, which sounds very dry until you meet L'Orsolina. We have a lot of biographic, economic, and geographic information, and a dash of sex thrown in. So all the information that you heard came from a brief 1561 census entry. You can see the location of Orsolina's house on the DeSilva project map on the screen. She lives on the corner, not far from the Church of Santa Maria Novella, which today is just steps from the train station. So if you have taken the train to Florence, you have probably passed by this church. Orsolina's house was one of over 9,000 households enumerated in the 1561 census by Duke Cosimo I of Florence. Conveniently, the census offers information about the household head's name, gender, profession, and sometimes marital status, alongside property values and rent and number of people in the household. So when I first started using the Decima Project to teach social history about a decade ago, it was pretty amazing that this far from the Archivio di Stato in Florence, we could open the doors as we walked down the street effectively in Florence and see who lived there at this moment in time, and that we could see who Orsolina's neighbors were. So the first assignments that I ran in my classes were exercises in charting social ties and neighborhood amenities. So real social geography work. Students created likely social networks for a handful of household heads, not Medici or Strozzi or Rucellai patricians, but a weaver, a widow, a nun, a fisherman, a baker, a surgeon, and of course, Orsolina, our sex worker. Then students applied ideas about urban life, which we had been discussing all semester, to the streets of the quarter and their social network. We found the bakeries and the groceries and the parish churches using a commercial census from the same year. And we thought about how one might actually walk to the tavern or find a barber surgeon, and whether one had enough money to visit the butcher regularly or even at all. Students created maps to show their person's network and then justified their choices. What we found was that our discussions became a study of class and profession, so two important aspects of social geography, which are intimately connected in the early modern world. And our questions about the past included: what experiences and necessary amenities did Florentines share? How does one's profession steer one's social network? And are there indications of class separation in the census and on the streets? So this was the beginning of working with the Decima Project. And since then, we've developed far more complex investigations, and we've learned to ask more questions about urban life in the 1500s. So now I'm going to turn to a more recent research project that I've done with students. Could I please ask volunteer number 2 to read from their envelope, please? There we go.
Thank you. Let's take this out. And the winner is Dante Alighieri for Ir Paradiso. Dante couldn't be here today, so I'm going to read.
Thank you.
In 1561, on the Via del Limbo, two laundresses shared a house owned by the wealthy Gianfigliazzi family. Mona Benedetta and Mona Sandra paid 3 lire and 7 scudi respectively in annual rent. Next door lived Pasquina Fiorentina, a registered sex worker. Around the corner on the Via del Purgatorio were 3 more sex worker households.
Thank you very much. So once again, all the information that you heard came from the 1561 census via the Decima Project. Female-headed households stand out in the census. There are households that do not, these are households that do not have a patriarch completing the census interview with enumerators. So there was no filling out census forms. Our enumerators walked door to door talking to each household head, seeing them face to face. And these households that were led by women tended to be poor, they tended to be smaller, and further from the urban center. There's been a lot of research about contemporary fears that poor women without a father, a husband, or a brother to care and provide for them would turn to sex work. Contemporaries worried because, frankly, there was a huge market for selling sex, and many early modern men married later or did not marry at all, chiefly because they worked in low-wage professions like weaving. Florence was a center for weaving cloth and then eventually weaving silk as well. Most men never became guild masters, and many unmarried men lived together in rented accommodation or with married relatives. So to assuage fears that neighboring women would emulate sex workers, Florence passed laws separating sex workers from other households by creating buffer zones. From the 1400s through the mid-1500s, these buffer zones shrank dramatically. The Florentine government needed to tax sex workers to fund the convent for retired sex workers that we just heard about. So Santa Elisabetta de Convertite. And so they moved sex workers slowly inside the city walls and closer to the center of the city. By 1547, sex workers were expected to live within the city, but only on 18 streets. Or they could live in the brothel in the center, or they could pay a fee and live wherever they wanted. So keep that in mind. There is always a way to circumvent the law. Census records allow us to think more concretely about groups and individuals. So, with a couple of graduate students, that's what we did. Catherine Curtin Johnson and Brandon Whitsett were the graduate students that I worked with on that course that was comparative that Anne told you about. It was really a lot of fun. And we compared the location of female-headed households and the location of sex worker households using the 1561 Florentine census. Oh, and it works now. Look at that. So what you see on the screen is a map showing the 18 permitted streets and the sex worker households that we identified in the 1561 census. So the red lines are the permitted streets and all the purple dots are the sex worker households. So my question for the audience is, were sex workers living solely on the permitted streets? I'm seeing a lot of shaking heads. No, you are absolutely right. And so these women either paid the fee and received an exemption, or they lived wherever they wanted and they took their chances. And it's not always clear which group they were in. So let's return to the laundresses on the Via del Limbo. And you can see I've put a yellow oval around the household of Monna Benedetta and Monna Sandra so that you can see precisely where they lived. So the image on the screen is from the article that I wrote with Kathy and Brandon about Florentine fears about proximity between sex workers and female-headed households. We found that there were areas across Florence where low-income women lived next door to sex workers. Now, this was exactly what Florentines feared. Poor women in high-effort but low-wage work like laundry might consider turning to sex work. And if they had questions about how to do so, their neighbors might procure clients for them. So here is a version of the figure that you just saw with highlighted streets. So all three streets that I've highlighted on the screen housed sex workers and low-income female-headed households. Sorry, just making sure that I know where I am in my notes. Okay, these three streets were not so spacious as to prevent knowledge of one's neighbors. So you could definitely hear what was going on across the street or in the building next door. Now, on the Green Street, the Via del Inferno, there were several all-male households and a tavern shaded in blue where these households might meet to eat, to drink, and to chat, or who knows, to drum up business. On the Via del Limbo, in purple, you can see Madonna Sandra and Madonna Benedetta's house, which was next door to Pasquina Fiorentina. On the Canto del Purgatorio, wonderfully evocative, this clearly was the Dante neighborhood, there were three more sex workers, and you can see three blue flags there. Three more sex worker households. Now, only the Via del Inferno, the Green Street, was a street that permitted sex worker households. Perhaps the other three households paid a tax, or perhaps they tried to fly under the radar. It is just not clear. We do not have lists of those exemption fee payers from this period. So, as you saw, without strict enforcement of the residential requirement, sex workers lived next door to the women that the laws claim to protect. In addition, buffer zones were also meant to separate sex workers from churches, from monasteries and convents. Now, I'm going to ask the audience again, why do you think this might be important to Florentines? Why would the city want a buffer zone between sex workers and churches, monasteries, or convents? What might be the concern given what we know about the narrowness of streets and the thinness of walls? So precisely, the celibacy of monks and nuns. Do not forget the nuns. There we go. Quite a concern about especially younger monks or nuns who had just taken vows, perhaps, or even older monks or nuns who had been under vows for quite some time, and perhaps how high the monastery walls or how low they were comparatively. The noise of sex workers and their clients was notorious. Talking, laughing, singing, screaming, never mind the sex. It was all distracting to the neighbors, who often complained. But for men and women who had taken vows to give up the worldly life for prayer within convent or monastery walls, this could be a reminder of a lost life. Also, Florence's population of nuns was very large. It was almost 5% of the female population. And some of the nuns had taken vows to placate their family rather than themselves. So keeping them away from noise was very important. And the map that you see on the screen is an egregious example of subverting proximity laws. Some sex worker permitted streets led directly to convents. So I realize that the green lines are very thin. But what you see on the screen is the church and the convent of Sant'Ambrogio. The piazza in front of the church was a permitted sex work zone, as were 4 of the 5 streets that led to the piazza, that led to the square. I should also note that you can access the research that I'm talking about with Kathy and Brandon in a story maps format, which is a really nice digital storytelling platform. It's far easier to read and shorter than an academic article. You can use your phone or tablet camera to click the QR code and it will take you to our work, or you can just memorize the citation at the bottom of the screen. It was a lot of fun working on that article, and I encourage you to read it. So this project with Kathy and Brandon led smoothly into a second set of projects with undergraduate students in the Renaissance Study program. And in this course, we examined early modern cities and the place of taverns within them. Now, there were 3 strands to this project. Scholars have said that Florentine taverns were exclusively male sites, with the tavern keeper being an important link man in the community. Also, scholars have said that there were no women, either as workers or as clients in these really important community sites. But given how many taverns there were in Florence in 1561 and their role as places to buy food for eat-in or takeout, this seemed unlikely. There were 107 taverns and inns with taverns or places where you could buy drink in the city in 1561. So this is a lot. 107 is a high number. Now, that was one strand. We also wanted to know about working women. So outside the Italian peninsula, women were most likely to run taverns and alehouses or small inns. In England, in France, and in the American colonies, women routinely managed hospitality sites, although sometimes their husband's or their father's name was on the license. So in Venice in particular, women quite often ran sort of not quite rooming houses. They were like really small hotels called locande. And finally, our third stream, historians who work with judicial records have already shown that some taverns were sites of sex work, both heterosexual and homosexual sex work. But if there were no women in taverns, how could there also be female sex workers arrested there? So in response to these historians, the question that we asked was, what relationships were there between the tavern keeper's household, female tavern staff, and sex workers? This was our big question. Now, just before I move on to talk about how we answered that, I'd like you to take a closer look at the engraving that I have on this slide. And I'm going to move it over just a little bit. There we go, so that you can see it better. So this is an illustration of a sample stage set for a comic play that was designed and published by Sebastiano Serlio in 1584. So he is showing us an image that could be used in a wide variety of, sorry, the word escapes me for a moment, stage sets, depending upon what sort of neighborhood you wanted to show. You could probably use this and be certain that you would have doors coming and going like Latin comedies, and it would just be sort of a recognizable community setting. So keep that in mind. That's key here. It should be recognizable to the people watching the play. Serlio tells us that the two spaces that I've highlighted are, in pinky purple, a procuress's house, and in yellow, a tavern. Their proximity on this stage set tells us that contemporaries would have associated sex work and procuring with the tavern. In fact, Serlio inscribes RVF or RUF for Rufiana on the wall of the procuress's house. So there's no doubt there. Sebastiano Serlio is suggesting that there were connections between taverns and sex workers, but what about working women? How can we bring that other strand into this conversation? And how would we prove this beyond a really lucky find with this engraving or this print? So, when we see tavern keepers in the 1561 census, women are never household heads. So could I ask, please, volunteer number 3 to read the text that they were given? And Michael, do you very conveniently have the microphone to read your own? Excellent.
In 1561, tavern keeper Jacopo d'Olivo d'Antonio, called the Beater, Il Picchia, lived on Via San Gallo in a house with 4 women and 3 men. He paid 6 scudi in rent for this apartment out towards the San Gallo gate. He also rented 2 other San Gallo properties for 60 lira that he ran as a small neighborhood tavern.
Thank you. So although Jacopo lived and worked in cheap and thus probably small spaces, his tavern was on the main thoroughfare coming into the city from the northeast. It was well placed to attract customers who might bring news to share with him. And he also appears much like the community linkmen that scholars talked about. But to answer questions about working women in taverns, we needed more and different primary sources. In addition to the Decima Project, we used another tax census from 1427 from Florence, criminal magistrate records and records from the magistrates that regulated sex work, and finally, guild records. So before we move on to talk about those sources, I have to give credit where credit is due. The 2 undergraduate students who worked with me, Samuel Didone and Diana Quiorani, created a Story Maps project showing, or I should say displaying, their research. And once again, you're welcome to take a closer look using the QR code on the screen. I'm so proud. Diana is now doing a master's in art history at New York University, and Samuel is doing a master's in public policy at the University of Ottawa. So proud. Sorry, guys. The Decima Project's 1561 census did not list any female tavern keepers as household heads. And it did not tell us if the male tavern keepers were married. It only listed the number of males and females in their households, so that is tricky. 67% of tavern keeper households in 1561 included women, though, and another 24% of tavern keeper households might have included women. So it's hard to know, since these were households that were in multi-household buildings, and enumerators only gave the male-female numbers for the building, but it's likely. Nevertheless, this underlines the possibility that Florentine tavern keepers' households encouraged wives and potentially even daughters to aid in the family business, as occurred in other businesses and in taverns outside Florence. So to get a bit more information, we also turn to another tax census from 1427. This is the Catasto. And it told us that 40 out of 49 tavern keeper household heads were married. So that's 81.6%, which is a high number. The same census told us that the size of those 49 households, larger households, perhaps either relatives or servants packed into them, suggested more people that might be available to work in the tavern. So larger household, more potential workers for the household's business. We also found that as the household grew in size, so did the likelihood that the tavern keeper was married. In households of 5 to 8 people, which was a third of all households, the tavern keeper was always married. And in households with 3 to 4 people, which was 41% of all households, 85% of the tavern keepers were married. So that was encouraging. The tax census from 1427 gave us some very useful context, but we needed to see those women in the mid-16th century taverns. We needed to be sure. Now, no historians had looked at guild records when discussing female tavern workers, which sort of surprised us. The State Archive in Florence houses the guild records documenting the regulation of tavern and innkeepers, along with tailors and second-hand dealers and linen sellers and wine sellers and poultry dealers. They were all in the same guild. It must have been chaotic. But what we found with these records was still a partial view. Mostly, guild records focused on guild masters who tended to be male. A matriculation book that covered the period from 1536 to 1601 identified 3,025 people who joined the guild. About 11% of this group, 191 men and 27 women, matriculated as innkeepers. 93 men and just 1 woman matriculated as tavern keepers. Now, it does look like there might be a missing record book for tavern and innkeepers, since their records only begin at 1570. So hope springs eternal. But we work with what we've got, right? Far fewer women joined the guild as tavern or innkeepers than as linen sellers, tailors, or second-hand dealers. So there are working women, women in businesses, who are guild participants, but it seems not to the same level in taverns and inns. So what we concluded was that a few women inherited guild membership from their father, husband, or brother. Some women ran the tavern or the inn, but others passed their guild membership on to a male relative. In some cases, they probably did this because female guild members did not have full voting rights, and they wanted to ensure that their place of business had a say in the community. So this tells us that the business probably stayed in the hands of the family, and that those women likely continued to work alongside their family's new guild member. And at this point, we turn to criminal records to answer our questions about women who were identified as working in taverns. Okay, so this is the last one. Could I please have the person with envelope number 4, please read?
Hello. Okay. In 1565, Maddalena, widow of a tavern keeper in Via San Gallo, Piero, an innkeeper in Piazza del Grano, behind the Uffizi, and Matteo, another innkeeper there, collected girls to allow them to be negotiated.
Thank you. So the information that you just heard did not come from the tax census. It came from unpublished Florentine criminal records. And these records tell us when something went wrong in a tavern, or when they were found out. Perhaps that's a better way of putting it. So we learn about the victim, the prosecuted individuals, the infraction, and of course the punishment. So what we found was interesting. There were more women who identified as tavern and innkeepers, hostessa or albergatora, in these records than we found at all in the census or the matriculation data. Often these women appeared charged with saying injurious words, so verbal abuse, against sex workers or procuring them to work in their tavern, I guess, as an extra attraction for the drinkers. So we also found more women like Maddalena, who were widows or daughters of tavern keepers. Another example is Verdiana, daughter of Andrea, the tavern keeper, who was a sex worker in 1561. Now, there was no record of her father either living with her or heading his own household or as a tavern keeper in 1561. Indeed, it seems like he had died more than a decade before. We found a woman named Caterina in the 1551 census who might have been his widow, and Verdiana's mother, who was already a widow. It's sort of unclear, but it's likely. Now, records from the magistracy that regulated sex work, the Ufficiali dell'Onestà, also identified widows of tavern keepers working as procuresses. In 1569, there were 4 procuresses, all female, and they were registered with the magistrates. One was Monna Margherita, the daughter of a different Piero, the tavern keeper. At least it's likely it's a different one, but who knows? She lived on Via dei Pentolini, now Via de' Macchi. Now, the same list identifies 7 sex workers living on a 200-meter long street, Via dei Pentolini. One of these workers, one of these women, was Ceccia, another daughter of Piero the tavern keeper. In that case, it's the same Piero. We think that Ceccia was likely Margherita's sister and might have been helped by her procuring work. So these examples encouraged us to think that the orphans and widows of tavern keepers turned to sex work and procuring to pay the bills. Not only was this in keeping with contemporary fears, but it also aligned with our discovery that tavern keeper households tended to pay rents that were lower than the citywide average. And this might indicate a precarious financial situation for surviving wives and daughters. So to determine if this was common, we went back to the magistrates that regulated sex work. And we identified a continuous run of records that would represent a reliable slice of Florentine life. As the graph on the screen shows, there were 23 convictions between 1593 and 1601 involving men and women in taverns or who were tavern staff. So all 4 convicted procurers in this sample were women. One was an innkeeper, another was the widow of a tavern keeper, and another 2 procured at the Bucco Tavern. The other woman in this sample was denounced as a sex worker and identified as living at an inn. So in contrast to this focus, women being involved in illegal labor, men were convicted of violent acts against female sex workers. All the convicted men, so 39% of our total cases, and 50% of the male involvement, either physically assaulted a sex worker or created a racket outside her home. Notably, male tavern and innkeepers often appeared as guarantors for fines that convicted people had to pay. And this represents the other half of male staff in the sample. So what we see in the 1590s supported what we found snatches of in earlier decades. And this brings us back to the 3 strands in our project. First, that tavern keepers were link men in masculine communities and that taverns could be violent places. They absolutely were. And our men in the sample show that, yes, they were probably link men. But we also found that there were working women in Florence's taverns and inns, just as there were in other places across the city. These were not entirely male spaces. And finally, women working in Florence's taverns and inns sometimes participated in procuring and in sex work. much as contemporaries feared. So I hope that this presentation has showed how the digital humanities and Renaissance studies can come together in interesting and data-rich ways. Thank you for listening.